In October 1962, Pope John XXIII opened the first session of the Second Vatican Council. In doing so, he inaugurated what is generally seen as having been the most significant ecclesiastical event of the 20th century. John died in the summer of 1963, but the work was continued by his successor, Pope Paul VI, and the Council, which comprised all of the bishops of the Catholic world and the heads of major religious orders, together with several thousand advisors, met in 4 sessions until it concluded in 1965. The Council itself was seen as entirely unexpected. There had been no similar event since 1870, when the First Vatican Council had declared the Pope to be infallible. In the intervening 90 years, the Roman Catholic Church had become ever more isolated from the rest of Christianity. It had no interest in ecumenism, and it developed an extremely authoritarian style of leadership. It was deeply suspicious of changes in theology and in modern life and thought, and it tried to impose a rigorous scholastic orthodoxy with the condemnation of what was known as modernism in 1907. In the following decades, Catholic theologians, particularly the ordained majority, had to operate in an environment of suspicion. Meanwhile, life in the parishes continued on the premise that Catholicism was the only valid form of religion and that it was the duty of Catholics to be obedient to the Church. In calling the Council, Pope John made it plain that he wanted to bring about major renewal. Famously, he said he wanted to open the windows and let in fresh air. There is no doubt that this is what he did, although nearly 50 years on, there is still much debate about what the legacy of the Second Vatican Council has really been. To discuss this and other questions relating to Vatican II, I spoke to Professor Tom O'Loughlin, Professor of Historical Theology at the University of Nottingham. He and I are both historians of Christianity, and we're both around the same age, but because of our different backgrounds, we have very different perspectives. Tom was born in Dublin in 1958, into one of the most intensely Catholic societies ever seen in the 20th century. His perspective on Catholicism is therefore that of an insider. I, on the other hand, was born into a secular environment in Hertfordshire around the time the Council was opening. But because of the separate school system, I never actually met a Catholic until I went to university. At university, I first came across Vatican II when we studied it as one of the most recent events on the church history syllabus. So my perspective has always been that of a modern historian and an outsider. Well, Tom, you're a man with a very long memory, and you can actually remember what the Catholic Church was like before Vatican II in Dublin in the early 60s. So what was it like?
Yes, I came at the very tail end of the pre-Vatican II Church, in that I began to serve on the altar, being an altar boy, just within a few years of the end of the Latin, the Eucharist being celebrated in Latin. And it was, I remember the closing ceremony of the council. I remember listening with my mother to the radio to the closing of the council. But where the council first impinged on my consciousness was a small change in rules that led to an enormous change in practice. And that is that in 1964, the fasting time before going to Holy Communion, which was then seen almost as a distinct act from the Eucharist, one of the abuses that the Council sought to and successfully remedied, the fasting time had been reduced in the late 50s from midnight to 3 hours, and then we were being told, getting ready to make our first Holy Communion, it was a 3-hour fast. And then one day I remember the teacher coming in, and she said to us, the fasting time has now been reduced to 1 hour. So that was the first impact it had on my life, and I was just aged 6 years old. And then as between 6 and 12, I saw the end of the old rite. First of all, the old rite went into English, then gradually the old rite was simplified, and then I have a very clear memory of the first Sunday of Advent in 1969 when the new rite came in, and then every couple of years one or other parts of the Roman liturgy were changed and brought into conformity with the will of the fathers of the Second Vatican Council. So between the age of 6 and 16, I saw all the changes coming in. And I remember the first day, I remember a friend who's the local curate showing us the first documents had been translated.
One of the points which is made by historians writing about it, admittedly in relation to England, is that the changes were often very poorly explained. Would that have been your experience?
That would not have been my experience, because I was in a parish which had a long tradition of theologians being appointed as parish priest and curates. In fact, probably one of the reasons I became a theologian was that when I was a little boy I met loads of theologians. But I know that in other parishes many clergy just saw this as hassle. It was a lot easier, of course, for a priest to go through the old rite in Latin. Just imagine a Sunday morning, someone else preached, another priest celebrated the Eucharist. It was done almost without consciousness of the people there. In fact, whether it was done on a private altar or on the high, what was then known as the high altar, it was a ritual which was independent of people. And then suddenly clergy had to face the demands of communicating and explaining, and actually, to use a word that was seen almost as derogatory, they had to actually show that it was relevant. And this made demands, and they were often poorly trained. They didn't realise what the council was about. And I've heard priests looking back saying, oh, it was a lot of hassle. And that has led, of course, to some priests saying, oh, it was... While lay people on the whole saw the council as a good thing, because suddenly they could understand, there were lots of clergy who didn't know what was really happening. They had been in a culture where they just followed rules. The rules changed, they just followed the rules. They didn't explain what was going on. So poor explanation lies at the heart of a lot of the problems that are still affecting the Catholic Church today.
And of course the Council now tends to be thought of in terms of the documents which it published, the documents of Vatican II. Paperback, published on very thin paper. It's been a very familiar volume. Lots of documents, I think about 16, but really two that we tend to focus on. One relating to ecumenism, which of course transformed the way in which Catholics think about other Christians and also members of other faiths, particularly the Jews, and liturgy. And of course you've already touched on the liturgy. Those are the two that have tended to have the biggest impact. And would you agree? And do you think there are other things in those documents which are now rather got lost that people should be rediscovering?
At one level, the changes in the liturgy are visible, and they affected every parish, they affected every community the world over. And so obviously, in terms of visible impact, that was the most important document. And that document led to a complete revision of the liturgy, and that revision stretched over a period of well over a decade. The decree on ecumenism changed the attitude with regard to other Christians, and particularly the Christians of the Reformation. It went from an attitude of seeing people as schismatics at best, heretics at worst, or just benighted, foolish people, to being the recognition that Catholics had to enter into dialogue. So obviously that was another very visible thing. the idea that Catholics could just be seen on the same, today it's quite unimaginable that, for instance, a great occasion would take place and that Catholics would not take part in it, at least be seen among the congregation. Only 50 years ago, the Catholics would just not have taken part in the ceremony. Recently there was a royal wedding, and there were lots of Catholic representatives there, and the big breakthrough this time was that a cardinal had come over from Ireland. 50 years ago, they just would not have been seen in the same group, because that would have been seen literally as consorting with heretics, and to be there would have been seen to be giving them some sort of passive approbation.
That's
so
the wedding of the future church leader, future head of the Church of England, of course.
Yes.
Yes.
But in a way, if you're to understand Vatican II, you have to look at its most important, the two most important documents are the two least read. The document on the Church, Lumen Gentium, and the decree on sacred revelation. The decree on revelation changed how Catholicism sees the role of theology. And from working from a model of theology that there is a box of answers and that all you have to do is crank the machine and more answers come out, it was the awareness that theology is an exploration. Now that is something that is only beginning to enter into, it's there in the academic consciousness of a lot of Catholics, but it's not yet present in the lived consciousness. So there are many Catholics still today who think that there's just a book of answers and that theology is just looking up the answers. But the decree on revelation is virtually unread. And then there's the document on the Church. Again, in the 1950s, the dominant image was that of the Church is the mystical body of Christ. The other image that was used was the Church is the perfect society. The problem with the mystical body of Christ is that a body is a discrete entity, and you're either in it or you're out of it. And also the corporate image, while it has an immense history going all the way back to St. Paul, has the problem that you think of it as a single mind controlling every bit. So I can think now I'm moving my toes, I'm moving my fingers. It's a very, corporate images have strength, but they have a lot of weakness. The perfect society image presupposes the lighthouse in the midst of the stormy sea. The Constitution on the Church and another document giving it practical effect called Gaudium et Spes, Joy and Hope, move the image decisively to that of the pilgrim people of God. Being a pilgrim people presupposes change, it presupposes imperfection, it presupposes movement, it presupposes growth. So instead of seeing perfection as a commodity, perfection stands at the end of the pilgrimage, and perfection is the desire of the Church rather than something it owns. Again, this is something that has been taken on board intellectually, and it's something that's preached, but many Catholics are still default to the idea of the Catholic Church as the high-walled perfect city. It has the answers, and that is creating a tension, because of course, whether one likes that image or doesn't like it, reality is reality. We are a people of imperfection. We are a people of movement.
So 50 years on from the council, it sounds to me as if your final reflection would be that the council is still having a lot to tell the church and that the documents need to be considered in their entirety.
The Vatican Council, though it ended in the 1960s, and I remember listening to the radio to the final closing ceremony, is more an agenda for the Catholic Church than something in its past.
Professor Tom O'Loughlin, thank you very much.
Thank you.